Hello and welcome to Your State with Representative Chris Davis, myself. And as many of you know, we have the upcoming legislative session beginning in February, and I've asked Representative Larry Cafero of the City of Norwalk to come and join me. He is our House Minority Leader in the State House of Representatives. Thank you, Larry, very much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here, Chris.
Great. And I'd like to get into what we're going to tackle in the next legislative session, but before we do, I'd like to address some of the things that have come up in recent weeks involving state workers. Alleged fraud involving the distribution of food relief money following Storm Irene has created widespread coverage. Should we be surprised, and what should we be doing about this situation?
Well, first of all, Chris, I think, to be fair to everyone, it's our understanding that there were 2,400 people that took advantage of this system after Storm Irene. And by way of background, what it was is many people, because of the loss of power, had considerable amounts of food spoil. And we were most concerned about the neediest of our citizens, those that already get food assistance from the state. What would they do if they had an entire refrigerator of food that they were going to use over a period of time spoil? So that's the genesis of this very well-meaning program. The problem came on two ends. One, some unscrupulous people who wanted to take advantage and defraud the state, and the other, a state system that has no check or balance with regard to fraud. So what happened is you had about 2,400 people apply and receive benefits, and of those 2,400 people, 800 of them happened to be state employees. That doesn't mean that all state employees defrauded the state. The question was, how many did? The administration has been unclear as to that. But in any event, whether it was 1, 50, or 800, it's wrong. Whether they were state employees or non-state employees, it's wrong. And unfortunately, there's no way to legislate the criminal or fraudulent intent on a person. Those things happen. Where you could help is the system that gives out these benefits. It has to be built to prevent against fraud. And what we're learning right now is we have a culture in our state government that says, when in doubt, give it out. You were hearing about people who made in excess of $125,000 a year that were receiving taxpayer money to fill up their refrigerators. And not only is it tax fraud, it also is the cruelest thing you could do for those who truly are needy of this help. They got deprived because someone lied. That's wrong. And what we have to do is not only prosecute those who defrauded the state, but also look internally. The governor needs to look to his state agency and say, what is wrong with the culture or the system that would allow someone to get away with this? That's our #1 task.
Now, I know last year we presented our Republican alternative budget, and in that budget we had proposals to increase our ability to find Medicaid fraud. What was the majority party's response to that, and have any steps been taken here at the state level?
Well, first of all, a quick background. Where that came up with is we learned nationally there is about 9% fraud in Medicare and Medicaid on a statewide basis. 9%. Billions upon billions of dollars. We went to our own state Medicaid fraud unit, and they said in Connecticut they estimated to be even higher than 15%. So we wanted to be conservative in our estimates. We used 5%, and we asked them, how could we try to recover or prevent at least 5% of fraud? They indicated if we were to add 20 more fraud detection officers, that could save upwards of $250 million. And these officers, by the way, would not be at the full expense of the taxpayer of Connecticut. 75% of their salaries are paid by the federal government because it's important to the federal government to crack down on fraud. When we presented that in our budget, it was scoffed at and laughed at. It was laughed at as a gimmick and smoke and mirrors, and it really didn't make sense. Well, the sad fact is that we're learning that fraud throughout government, whether it's Medicaid, some of the benefits we talked about, is rampant. And this administration has not only done nothing to prevent it, they've actually scoffed and laughed at those who've suggested it, and that's a missed opportunity.
Sure. So should the perpetrators, or if they're proven guilty to actually have committed fraud, these state employees, should they potentially lose their jobs in response?
Well, I think potentially is a good word. And I say that, and I'm a lawyer by profession, so I don't want to start splitting hairs. But if it's clear that they defrauded the state, and that was their intention, it wasn't unintentional, it wasn't a mistake or a reasonable miscalculation based on the information they were given. And by the way, I doubt it could be, because when you're going to get a food handout, if you will, which is what this program was, you know whether or not you deserve it. And if you don't, you shouldn't have been there. If that's the case, and there was premeditated intent to commit fraud, they should be fired, absolutely.
And you mentioned that, you know, some of the proposals in cracking down on this fraud could save tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars here for the state of Connecticut. You know, what is the general condition of the state's health following the state's largest tax increase in history?
Well, you know, Chris, I would say tenuous at best. And if you'll give me a second here to explain that, you know, when we came into the past session, it was no secret we were in rough shape. We faced a $3.2 billion deficit. And our new governor said, we're going to handle this three ways. We're going to raise taxes, and he did, $1.5 billion. We're going to cut spending, and I would argue he did not. He actually increased spending. And the third place we were going to save money is through state employee concessions. And he estimated he would, attempt to get $2 billion. He then conceded he couldn't get that. He got $1.6 billion, he said. And now we're learning every single day that not only didn't he get 1.6, he might not even have gotten $1 billion worth of savings out of the so-called concessions by the state employees. And that means that all of the burden went on the taxpayer. And all those cuts that he said he would never make if he was allowed to, one, tax, and two, get those concessions. You see every day, Chris, go to the DMV and try to get a license or a permit or some sort of paperwork. You wait in line for hours and hours and hours. And a lot of the agencies that are trying to make up for the deficits that we said would never happen can't do it by way of reducing a workforce, because part of the agreement the governor made with the unions was no one loses their job for 4 years and everybody gets at least a 10% raise over 5 years. So the only place they could make up for that savings is by cutting direct services to people. So instead of having 4 or 5 locations to get your license, maybe you have one. So it became what the governor called shared sacrifice, was actually the worst of all worlds, in that we're paying the highest taxes in the history of the state and we're getting less services for it. And as far as any further action we could take, if there's, God forbid, a second recession, we are prohibited from doing that because of the collective bargaining agreement that the governor entered into with the unions.
And one of the questions I get a lot from my constituents coming up with this new legislative session is, what are we looking forward to? What are we going to do? How are we going to tackle these issues, these fiscal issues that are affecting the state so deeply?
Well, I hope head on. First and foremost, you need honest information. You can't hide behind, well, we're not sure. We think, so many people question me. They say, Larry, with the state in as bad shape as it is, with all the debt it has, the most in the nation, how could we still use the word surplus, where surplus means we have more money than we owe? Well, they're absolutely right. It's what I call government speak. And what we have to do, and will do as a caucus, is hold this administration's feet to the fire. We want the real numbers. And if in fact we are in deficit, then we need to act now so that that deficit doesn't grow and grow and grow as it always does. The other thing we need to do is control spending. And when people say we've cut to the bone, well, when you read about the Department of Social Services doing what we just talked about with regard to this DSNAP program, or when you read about the fact that they're sending checks out to dead people, that's our money. That's our taxpayers' money. And those are the things we need to focus on and correct.
So what are some of the biggest issues that you see that we will be tackling specifically in this next legislative session?
I think always the budget, always the budget, and making government more efficient. I know that education and education reform is always a big issue, and hopefully that we could tackle that issue as well. There are so many, much of which are related to a budget, but whether it be government waste and fraud, education, transportation, our environment, our energy policies, these are the things that we still have on our plate and need to address as soon as possible.
So you mentioned education reform. What are some of the ideas you've been hearing are out there for the next legislative session?
Well, you know, the governor himself mentioned, and to this I applaud him, he mentioned tenure reform. We have a system that dates back many, many hundreds of years that says after a certain amount, maybe 3 or 4 years, a teacher's tenure is there, and unless it's for cause, a teacher can never be dismissed or frankly even reprimanded. A lot of people say, hey, we should have 5-year renewable contracts. You enter in a contract with a teacher at the end of 5 years, you have to, re-up again. So those are the kind of things we're looking for. We as a state just got denied for the 3rd time the race to the top money, the federal race to the top money. And there's another area where I agree with President Obama and his Secretary of Education, Secretary Arne Duncan. When they have people apply for this government money, they want to see real reform, not tinkering around the edges, real reform. And why? Because they realize time is of the essence for our kids, whether it's closing the achievement gap or bringing us into the 21st century and being competitive in a global economy. Our education is key, and if we are just going to tinker around the edges, we will fail. And that's why the federal government has denied our application, not once, not twice, but 3 times, because Connecticut doesn't have the courage to truly reform.
Now, speaking on education too, we learned today that UConn recently approved tuition hikes, looking at large hikes over the next 4 years. What are some of the steps that the state can take in looking into this issue and increasing costs at our state university system?
Well, it's accountability again, Chris. We learned earlier this year that we pay the little things were slipping through the cracks. For instance, the University of Connecticut was paying its chief of police something like $270,000 or $80,000 a year, when the chiefs of police of our largest cities in the state don't make that.
Yeah. And the deputy chief was making over $200,000
exactly. a year. Now, I understand that's been corrected, but how many more instances of that are going on? And at the same time, you look to kids who are ever increasingly depending on a state higher education because of the economy out there. UConn, though a great value, don't get me wrong, with regard to in-state tuition, we have one of the highest in-state tuitions for our flagship university in the United States of America. And it's not fair, whether it's the taxpayers or the students, when you can't control your spending, to just say, sorry, you got to pay more, whether it's taxes or tuition. It's not fair. We owe more than that.
I agree, and it's a situation where younger people are finding it very tough to even go back to college now because of tuition hikes, and families are struggling tremendously trying to send their kids even to state schools. So it's a situation where we need to really tackle this issue head on and try to lower those costs for our people in our state.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the other issues that comes up often is, we're talking about tax increases, and we're seeing people got hit really hard in September and heading into January, and we saw that many employees aren't having any taxes taken out right now because of failure of the system wasn't designed to go back to January. What are your thoughts on the retroactive tax increase and how hard it's hitting Connecticut's families, especially right now during the holiday season?
You hear story after story after story of when you're trying to collect 12 months worth of taxes in 3 or 4 or 5 months, the hit that people take in their paycheck at the time they need it the most, around the holidays, when they're buying fuel, oil, etc. It's almost criminal. It's almost criminal. And if you said, well, we get that, but we're sacrificing for a better Connecticut, and yet you pick up the paper and you read about busways that are costing us millions and billions of dollars to go 7 miles, or the state UConn police chief making almost $300,000 a year, or you read about some of the other longevity payments that are going on, and the fraud and the payments to dead people, and you say, you know, it's criminal. It truly is criminal. And to then say, I broke my back to earn this paycheck. I wanted to put a little aside for the holidays, and not only are we taking what we normally take, but 3 times more because we have to make up for it. It's a very frustrating time for everyone.
Now, moving from that,
it didn't, if I might add,
sure, go ahead.
It didn't have to be that way.
Now, you said it doesn't have to be that way. You know, what was some of the alternatives that were put out there last year instead of raising taxes at historic levels, or instead of increasing the budget perhaps, which is what we're looking at now? What were some of the alternatives that were available?
Well, as you know, Chris, we put out, not for the first time, by the way, I might add, for the 5th consecutive time, a no tax increase budget. Now, a lot of people say, oh, how unrealistic is that? It was not unrealistic. You see, this state is the highest tax state in the United States of America. Just 2 years ago, we had what is now the 2nd highest tax increase ever. And we believe that enough is enough, that we should be able to live within our means. Everyone at home does that. Spend no more than you make. Borrow no more than you could afford to pay back. We have everyone in business and at home living that way. Why shouldn't we? We put forth a no tax increase budget. How did we balance it? We reduced our spending. We reduced our workforce by 5%. We cut into waste. We consolidated agencies. That's the way we did it. We made true sacrifices so we wouldn't have to once more sacrifice those who sacrificed so much, the taxpayers of the citizens of the state of Connecticut.
And you mentioned the highest cost of living, and we saw recently with the storms and the impact it had on Northeast utilities, and now they're coming back and saying it could cost up to $2 billion for them to actually improve their infrastructure. Now, as we both know, they've been charging the people of Connecticut the largest rates in the continental U.S. for many years. You know, what is your response to that? I know we as a House Republican caucus called for a special session to tackle some of these ideas before the next winter storm hits. What are some of your thoughts?
Well, what was so frustrating about all the storms, of course, and everyone was appropriately patient for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 days. But after a while, it was like enough is enough. Number one, we're in 2011, for God's sakes. Technology, communications is so advanced. Why should anyone in a small state of Connecticut be out of power for 10 and 13 days? And secondly, the other thing that struck so much of it, many of us, was that we're dependent on our health, education. They closed schools, hospitals were closed, our commerce, businesses were closed, even affected Election Day, all dependent on one company. There's something wrong with that picture, that a regulated industry, such as the electrical industry, that we regulate, we're totally dependent on for life's essential services. And what we said is, now that we've seen the lessons of Hurricane Irene and Storm Alfred, the October snowstorm, let's learn from those lessons. We've had every kind of task force, etc. Let's learn from those lessons and have a special session to correct them. And now here it is, 3 or 4 days before Christmas, and there's been no special session. That's wrong.
Now, is there any response that we can look forward to in the upcoming legislative session, because the majority party has kind of failed to call us into special session?
Well, we're hopeful. In fact, we're still putting for special session. We don't go into regular session until February, so we're certainly hopeful that we'll be called in prior to that to address these. We've gotten 2 reports from 2 committees. We have all the data. Let's act upon it before it gets lost in the shuffle of regular session.
I think that's a very important issue to tackle, because nobody wants to see that happen again. I spent many hours in the emergency centers in both my towns in East Windsor and Ellington, and communication was one of the biggest problems that we had. And I think that's something that we can do at the state level and put in the necessary mandates or regulations to make sure that that can be corrected. And I think it's something that we should tackle right away.
Absolutely.
If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact my office at 860-240-8700 or email me at christopher.davis@housegop.ct.gov. Thank you very much, Representative Cafero. Thank you for tuning in once again to Your State with me, State Representative Christopher Davis, and I thank once again House Minority Leader Larry Cafero for stopping by. Now, even though we've been out of session the last few months, I've been staying very active, and just the past few weeks we've seen a lot of activity down at the state capitol. As many of you know, we've had our decisions made on the redistricting plan. Every 10 years when the new census comes out, the state legislature has to change the districts so that everybody has one vote per one person. Now, because of the overwhelming population growth in both East Windsor and Ellington, those lines had to change. Now, I pushed hard to try to keep East Windsor in its entirety in the district, but unfortunately, because of the growth of the town, part of the town had to be lost to another legislative district. Now, I want to make sure everybody knows that I will still be representing everyone in East Windsor and everyone in Ellington until January 2013. But coming in the 2012 election, you'll have the opportunity, if you live in the new redistrict area of East Windsor, to vote for another state representative from the 59th district. But if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact my office. Now, as many of you know, I've been trying to stay very active in the community in the last few weeks. As you probably heard, I held a Salvation Army fundraiser at the East Windsor Walmart. We were able to raise nearly $800 for charity, with over half of that money going to the East Windsor Food Bank, the Five Corner Cupboard. And great timing right around the holiday season. I've also been staying very active with my business tours across the district. Just in the last few weeks, I visited AccuTime Systems in Ellington. They're a major producer of time clocks for Fortune 500 companies all the way down to small businesses across our country and across the world. And it's great to see that kind of business thriving here in Ellington, so much so they're looking to expand. But they need the right opportunity to do so, and here in the state of Connecticut, it's a tough time for small businesses. That's why I'm visiting with the North Central Chamber of Commerce for their breakfast with businesses on January 19th. So if you're a member of the Chamber of Commerce in Enfield, the North Central Chamber of Commerce, please stop by. I'd love to talk to you about how I can help your business. Also, I'll be holding office hours in Ellington at the Hall Memorial Library on 93 Main Street, right in Ellington, from 6 to 8 p.m. on January 23rd. So if you are from Ellington, please stop by. I'd love to hear your thoughts coming into the new legislative session. Also, on January 26th, I'll be visiting the East Windsor Economic Development Commission's and the East Windsor Chamber of Commerce's annual Business Roundtable. Great opportunity to hear from small businesses to large businesses right here in the district. Let me know what they need so I can be their voice in Hartford to try to get people back to work in our district. Also on January 31st, I'll be visiting the East Windsor Senior Center from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. trying to talk to seniors about any issues that are important to them, and so I can be their voice in Hartford as well for the upcoming legislative session. Also on January 31st, I'll be having office hours at East Windsor Town Hall from 6 to 8 p.m. So please stop by, let me know what you think, and I'll try to give a small presentation of what I think will be coming up in the new legislative session. Now, with these office hours, if you live in Ellington, you're unable to attend the Ellington office hours, please feel free to stop by the East Windsor ones. And if you live in East Windsor and you can't make it to the one on the 31st, please feel free to stop by on the 23rd in Ellington. And following up on East Windsor Senior Center as well, I'll be visiting the Ellington Senior Center on February 3rd from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., visiting with seniors, finding out what's important to them so I can take it back to Hartford to better represent all of you. Now, thank you all for watching. If you have any questions or concerns or wanted to speak with me directly, feel free to contact my office at 860-240-8700. That's 860-240-8700. Or you can always email me at christopher.davis@housegop.ct.gov, christopher.davis@housegop.ct.gov. Now, if you'd like to stay informed in all the activities that we're doing here at the state capitol, feel free to visit my website at www.repdavis.com. That's www.repdavis.com. You can sign up for my email updates, try to keep you informed of all the activities that are happening here in the state. Once again, thank you for tuning in to Your State with me, State Representative Christopher Davis, and I hope you have a great day.